You're listening to
Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington. Way below acceptable. Way below acceptable.
On this week's episode,
they still refer to each other as my esteemed colleague or my colleague. These people are not your colleagues, they're your ops. Okay? At this point, these people are your ops. They are hoping for political violence against your very existence. These people are trying literally to kill you.
Way below acceptable.
hey everybody, welcome to a new episode of Sticky Note Conversations. I am your host, Erika Washington, and I am super excited to be having this really special conversation today. And unlike usually how I say this is some old friend of mine or what have you, this is actually a person I am just meeting for the first time. But I started fangirling out over her work not that long ago. So I happened to be killing some time and going to the library. And I realized I hadn't actually been in a library in a long time. And I used to be an avid library goer, especially when my children were younger. And now I've just become to just buying all the books that I want. Anywho, I go into the library, I pick up all of these books, and one in particular caught my eye, and it was called No Human Involved: The Serial Murder of Black Women and Girls and the Deadly Cost of Police Indifference. And I wondered, what does that even mean, no human involved? This is one of the questions I'm going to ask Dr. Cheryl Neely, who is our special guest today on Sticky Note Conversations. She's a doctor. She's a sociology professor at Oakley Community College in Southeast Michigan. And she teaches courses in sociology and criminology. And so I would like to now welcome Dr. Cheryl Neely to Sticky Note Conversations. Welcome.
Thank you, Erika. I'm glad to be here.
I am so excited for this conversation. One, I always like talking to really smart Black ladies because I learned something and the conversation is just rich, which I know everyone's going to learn something today. But I want to start off with, actually, You're Dead, So What is actually another one of your books. And if I'm not mistaken, this one was first, correct?
Yes, it was first.
Okay.
That one was published in 2015.
Okay, so You're Dead, So What? Media Police and the Invisibility of Black Women as Victims of Homicide. Was this a dissertation?
It was based on my dissertation. The topic was a topic that I examined with my PhD dissertation, but I didn't look at police's role in reinforcing this invisibility of Black women as victims of homicide. It wasn't until after that I started deciding to write a book about it and doing my deep dive into media sources regarding murders of Black women and girls. I found that the police response was paltry and anemic and not forceful enough. So that's why I included police as another part of examining this phenomenon, and a very important part.
And so if I'm correct, in the beginning of No Human Involved, you talked about how this became a lifetime journey for you to understand and then let folks know what was going on, that it started with a friend of yours
Yes.
that was murdered while you were in high school. Tell us a little bit about what happened.
Well, in 1984, January of 1984, I was in my senior year, and I had a friend and schoolmate named Michelle Kimberly Jackson. She was actually closer in age and relationship to my sister Sawan, who was a year younger than me and in the same classes with Michelle. She disappeared from a bus stop. She was on her way to school at 6:45 in the morning, January 23rd. And this man, whose name is Kenneth Dupree, kidnapped her from that bus stop and forced her into an abandoned garage where he brutally raped, sodomized, and then strangled her. Michelle's death came on, I don't want to say the heels of, but at the time there were a series of rapes going on of Black girls in the city of Detroit. They were calling them the schoolgirl rapes. Between September of 1983, March of 1984, approximately 43 or 47 Black girls had been raped on their way to school. Michelle was the only homicide. And police's response and even media coverage to her death was not satisfactory at all. As a matter of fact, I think the Free Press and the news covered maybe a couple of days of coverage of her homicide, and then nothing else until a man was arrested within a year. And it was a man who was arrested named Eddie Joe Loy, who was actually innocent. And the Detroit police forced or coerced a confession out of this man. And he went to prison for 18 years until the Innocence Project out of LA with Barry Scheck got him free. They tested the DNA, found out that the semen did not match him, and he went free. But then again, the case went cold. So the actual killer wasn't found until 2019. And when he was found, he confessed to 7 other murders. So while police locked up an innocent man knowingly because they did not care about my friend Michelle, they didn't care about her heartbroken family, and they didn't care about the health and safety of other Black girls living in the city of Detroit, they railroaded an innocent man while the actual killer continued to perpetuate these crimes on other innocent victims. And this is what I found in my research over and over again. Police are indifferent when Black women die, and this emboldens killers to target us as a particularly vulnerable group.
Why do you think there is this prevalence across many police departments? This isn't just a Detroit thing, that they don't care about Black women, Black women's bodies, and Black women as human beings.
Well, in the book, I talk about the inception of enslavement in this country in 1619. Black women have not mattered in this country since the first Black bodies that were enslaved arrived on the shores of Jamestown. 20 slaves, 10 Black women, 10 Black men. We've never mattered. And during slavery, we only mattered when it came to the commodification of our bodies, when we were able to produce new slaves after they ended the transatlantic voyages of bringing slaves from the continent of Africa. So, the sadistic nature of white supremacy realizes, these women are women, in fact, and can procreate. So we don't have to bring bodies back across the Atlantic. We can just keep them pregnant and giving birth to more people to enslave. So if Black lives don't matter, Black deaths don't either. And that is the core of this indifference. We've never mattered when we're alive and breathing. So how much less do we matter when we are no longer here, when we die?
In your book, you talked about the no human involved. That's an actual phrase.
Yes, that's an acronym by police.
So the NHI phrase, that's found on some police reports and what have you, how does that make it through that someone allows someone to say no human involved when there obviously was a human involved? How does that even happen?
It happens in the sense that police don't see Black people as human beings. And again, we have to go back to the inception of policing, the institutionalization of policing, where they were initially slave patrol and slave catchers. That's how policing started in the United States. Black people were the representation of the criminal element in the nation of the United States. So this is part of the police lexicon. Some people might say it's a dark humor that police use to cope with the trauma of policing, like firefighters have used the term crispy critter to describe people who were burned to death in a fire. It is cruel, it is indifferent, it is macabre and unacceptable, but this is part of their lexicon. So no human involved basically was the vernacular that police would use when they did not want to investigate crimes committed against certain populations of people, primarily Black people, especially if they had a background of criminality or substance abuse or sex work. These were murders with no humans involved or misdemeanor murders. There's a white man named Norm Stamper, who was the chief of police for the San Diego Police Department. And he said that not only did they use no human involved, police would use that throughout the country, but especially in LA and in San Diego, they would also say these are misdemeanor murders. Now, we know murder is a felony, the most serious of all violent crimes. But if you kill someone Black, it's a misdemeanor, which is a little more serious than a civil offense. So if that's your attitude, you don't see Black people as human beings worthy of protection and worthy of a thorough and vigorous investigation to bring justice for them and their families when they're murdered, and to put that person who killed them behind bars.
During the course of your research and just over the course of the last 20 plus years, When you talk to cops, what have they said? Do they try to, like, I'm almost dumbfounded at this whole idea, but do they just sugarcoat it and say, yes, this is just the vernacular we use, but we don't really mean it?
What I've found in my research working with officers is an acknowledgement that yes, some incredulously that say they never heard of that term before, even though it's been on CSI television. There are movies you can Google "no human involved" and find one book after another written, a fictionalized version of this. So some will say they've never heard of it. Then others will say, well, I've heard of it, but I've never used it. And I've never been around a cop that would use that because I believe all victims matter and I'm outraged by this. So they kind of attribute it to the bad apple syndrome, I call it. Where they bad acts on behalf of police, these people are categorized as bad apples. But as I've said before, and I've even said this to my students in my criminology and sociology classes, that this tree keeps producing bad apples. So if you keep having bad apples, maybe the problem is with the tree and not the apples themselves. So the tree represents the system and the structure of policing. That's your problem. That's why it produces bad apples. So we still have a problem. Whether you want to attribute that to a few bad apples or to the tree itself, it's still a problem that needs redress.
There's been a movement of defunding the police over the past probably 5 or more years that phrase has become a little bit more popularized. And, do you think that defunding police would help in this situation as far as weeding out bad apples and replanting a new tree? Like, what do you think is a possible solution to, because you can't make someone think you're human. You can't.
No, you can't.
You can't force folks to like you. You can't force folks to, care about you as a human being or your family or your community.
Exactly.
So what's the throughway?
Well, that is a very complex question. If I had the solution to that, I could also solve world hunger and stop world wars and everything else. But I will address that because I've been asked that repeatedly. But I want to back up a little bit and defund the police, because I think we need to clarify what that means. That did not mean to stop paying for police. And unfortunately, in social protest and Black Lives Matter and whatnot, trying to come up with a simple way of going at this issue, they came up with this term, but that's not what they were talking about. Defunding the police simply means that you divert resources that go to policing, because policing is always the biggest budget of any municipal budget. It is always the largest part. More money goes to policing than anything else in a city. Especially a city that's grappling with crime, big cities and whatnot. And I talk about that extensively in the book. But it's about diverting some of those resources that go into policing into preventative measures. So we devote more to mental health. We improve education. We try to prevent crime so it doesn't escalate to the point where we have to get the police involved. So we use that funding a little bit different, but we still have a police force in place. But as far as the solution goes, that's a very difficult thing to come up with a solution for, because if we look at policing, police are 80% white and 80% male. So most police officers are white men. And does that automatically mean they're racist? No, but there is a greater probability that they will be. And as a result of that, you would have to have a test significant enough and sophisticated enough to weed out people who have racism in them, where they would perpetuate violence, brutality, and indifference on certain populations of folk, like people of color and Black people in particular, and indigenous populations. Unfortunately, the institution of policing draws certain personalities, and some of those personalities are authoritarian and are racist. And this is why I believe that training is not the answer, because it's not about training people. Like you said, you can't train racism or implicit bias out of people. If they don't see you as human, they don't see you as human. And if it was in fact a training issue and these police are making mistakes, then they make these same mistakes with white people. But they don't make these mistakes with white people. They only make those mistakes, mostly make those mistakes with us. So it's not about training. It's about the attitudes they possess before they even become part of the police force, before they even apply for the job. There's a certain personality, a certain worldview, a certain mindset that is in these people before they become officers. And how you weed those people out is a difficult thing to do. And if you were, in fact, to weed them out, you probably wouldn't have enough people to make up a significant amount of police in this country. What needs to happen, though, is you need to get rid of qualified immunity where these police officers personally suffer a loss of income and freedom if they violate the civil or human rights of someone that they're arresting. But when the onus falls on the cities and they pay out millions of dollars and that cop escapes accountability, then that adds to this issue. So what you need to do is you need to hold these police officers personally accountable so they'll think twice before they engage in bad acts. And I just don't know if that'll happen, especially under this current administration, Donald Trump, who's already done some things to embolden bad cops.
That's a whole conversation in and of itself.
Right.
You're listening to
Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington.
Something you said, thinking about the attitudes of certain folks, and you mentioned sex workers. And I know you talk about that in your book as well. Mm-hmm. And recently we've had on the podcast, we had a sex worker or former sex worker who's now doing adult film work. And she talked about the amount of safety that she did not feel in a lot of areas. And Nevada is the only state in the country that has legalized prostitution in certain parts of the state. It's not the entire state. It's not Las Vegas. It's not Reno, but it's in smaller communities where the population is smaller. I don't know why and how they came up with the policies and the terms of who can do it and who can't, but it's based upon you having less than 250,000 people in your county. But what I learned from that conversation with her was that there weren't always panic buttons in the room, and there weren't always spaces where they felt protected and safe to perform their job, because it is a job. And then there's also that space of when folks try to get out of the work, that they're blacklisted in a lot of ways because they have to register, because they have to have certain registration, certain cards, they have card carrying things to show that they're getting tested on a regular basis, that sort of thing. And there's this database. And so people are able to access that database. And so then they know, oh, you used to do this. And so then there's that. And she talked about policing and how, you know, there's just utter harassment by police officers. And then there's the idea of folks who end up murdered or raped and they're involved in sex work. And it's, oh, well, that's their fault. That's what they should, because that's the life they chose, or they put themselves in this own situation. Right. And I feel like that's a part of this whole space of not feeling like, I mean, I guess that would not just be including Black women, but other races and nationalities as well, but specifically Black women and Black young girls who are trafficked, that they're not looked for and they're not thought about as even being trapped. They just ran away. And I'm wondering how we as a community can learn to drop our biases on what someone's work is, so that we can help alleviate some of that stigma as well.
Well, I wanted to say, I want to come back to that question, but I wanted to make a point because that comes up sometimes when people read my book. The way the book is organized, there are 6 chapters. Each chapter focuses on a set of serial killings from 1970s Boston all the way through the 2000s in Chicago. Right now in the city of Chicago, there's more than 51 unsolved strangulations of Black women that community has been saying on the west and south sides that there is a serial killer hunting and targeting Black women. Police are saying there is not. And when you don't believe there's a serial killer, you're not going to hunt for one, and you're not going to have a sufficient enough investigation to catch that person or persons involved in those homicides. But oftentimes that comes up as maybe that's the reason why police are less, eager or vigilant in trying to go after the people that commit these crimes. But in the book, because as someone with a PhD that has a dissertation, you have to defend your research. So you have to anticipate that they're going to ask you certain questions that will challenge your findings. So I present the case of Arthur Shawcross, who in the 1980s, 1989 exactly, in Rochester, New York, killed 11 women who were sex workers. And police launched a full-out investigation. They declared it a serial killing. They warned these women who were on the stroll where these women were being targeted, that they were being targeted by a man who was killing women and dumping their bodies in a river gorge and in the wooded areas out throughout Rochester, New York. And they even got the FBI involved to come up with a personality print or profile of who this person might be.
Mm-hmm.
What was the difference? All of those women were white. The Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, killed close to 30 women. Most of these women were white. Quite a few of them were hitchhiker and sex workers. In Long Island, they've been looking for this guy. They finally got him. Serial killer. All of the women he was killing were white sex workers. Joel Rifkin in New York, 1980s, I believe, late 70s, early 80s, all white women, sex workers. So race matters. When a white woman is a sex worker, she matters far more than a Black woman who is. Now, going to your question about bias in the community, if you're talking about the community of Black people, are you talking about the Black community?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because the role of the church is so significant in the Black community, less than it has been in years past, but still significant. Attitudes about sex work and even the queer community, trans and gay people, tends to be quite conservative and anti, very phobic. So there has to be sort of like a paradigm shift, a way that we see people. We have to see them as human beings. And there are biblical references of how, Jesus treated sex workers, how he treated the prostitutes. I mean, he wasn't hanging out with the super religious Sadducees and Pharisees. He was hanging out with the criminals, the people who needed him, the people he was trying to bring into salvation. But because we as a community have a disdainful, judgmental view of people who are out there, that has to shift in order for us to see these individuals as more human. And the interesting part of it is, the irony is that most Black families have someone in their family who has struggled with these issues, who have had a drug problem. Maybe a female in their family has had a drug problem. And as a result of that drug problem, she engaged in sex work to support her drug habit. If it wasn't for her drug habit, she wouldn't have been on the streets, which is what a lot of these women that were murdered that I cover in my book, that's what drew them into sex work. They were trying to support a habit. So that's a difficult one because of this bias that comes from a religious, disdainful view of this population of people. And that has to shift.
I'm thinking about the root of the problems, right? In the way that you talk about sex work can sometimes stem from drug abuse. And so if someone has an addiction to something, then they might make those choices. And getting to the root of the drug use, especially in marginalized communities, there's usually other things going on. There's other poverty issues happening at the same time. So thinking about policy and what policies could be enacted or advocated for that might lead to connecting the dots to all of these things. I think it has come from a few different angles at the same time. There would have to be police policies, but there also has to be things that would directly affect a community that lifts it up out of certain circumstances that would hopefully lead to less folks on the street. And I want to say safer communities, but it's not all serial killers, right? Like, even if it's not a serial killer that murders a Black woman and the police don't care about it, it's just a murder in general, right? Like, it's just,
I mean, some people are killed as part of the drug trade itself. People that are selling drugs, people that are using drugs, people that are selling their body in pursuit of drugs. I mean, violence is a systemic part of that whole world. So, yeah, there are people who are murdered, and not necessarily by someone who's a serial killer, but being involved in certain types of lifestyles can put you at a greater risk of running into people who want to take your life.
But I think about policing and the over-policing and the amount of money that's spent on policing, especially in certain larger cities, or Detroit or Chicago or St. Louis, wherever, where they spend all of this money to help fight crime.
Mm-hmm.
But crime doesn't actually lessen in a lot of these areas.
No, Black communities are the most over-policed and unsafe communities in the country. We have the presence of, I live in a very, suburban community, an upper middle class community, mostly white in Michigan. And I rarely, if ever, see the police. I can count the number of police cars I've seen in a day. But if I were to cross into the thresholds of Detroit, I see a cop car almost everywhere. There's almost an absence of violent crime happening in the city I live in. I mean, if there is violence, it's happening in the home. It's more like a domestic violence related incident. And the possibility of violent crime is everywhere, but the probability is less depending on your community. So there aren't very many police here, and this community is safe. But you go to larger inner cities where there are mostly Black and brown folk living there, and you see lots of police, but you still have a high rate of violence.
Yeah. Well, they'll say the problem is the people then, right? It's the people. They're animals. They're crazy. They're violent. They, whatever. That's why there's so much crime.
Well, you want to attribute it to personal circumstances, individual circumstances, and instead of systems and structures, which is what I do as a sociologist. When we see a social problem, and it's a social problem because it's something that affects a large swath of the population, social problems are rooted in structural and systemic issues. So if you just want to see it as an individual problem, then you can slap a label on somebody as crazy or criminal and keep it moving. But when you see the issue rooted in the social structure and society in general, then you have to fix society. And fixing society requires money. Where does money come from? It comes from tax dollars. So taxpayers have to agree to allow their tax dollars to be spent a certain way. And because this country is, irretractably racist, they're not going to agree to tax dollars being spent a certain way. This is why, of all the westernized high-income countries in the world, the United States is the only one without a universal health care program. This is why we don't have socialized childcare. This is why our schools suffer. This is why we have so many problems. Heather McGhee wrote a brilliant book called The Sum of Us. Mm-hmm. And she talked about that. Jonathan Metzl, a psychiatrist and also a sociologist, he wrote a book called Dying from Whiteness, Why Rural America is Dying from Opioid Overdose, because there isn't enough funding in healthcare and substance abuse treatment because they keep voting for a political party, the GOP, that fights funding for these sources. So as long as this country remains racist and white people vote against their own social and economic interest, we're going to continue to have these problems. It's not until it impacts them in a larger degree that they'll finally see the true cost of the way that they vote. But right now, they have not seen that. Someone said to me before that racist white folk, they don't mind getting a cold if you get pneumonia as a Black person. So they will do without as long as it hurt. It may hurt them, but it hurts you worse. So they can live with that.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where someone always needs somebody to shit on. Someone has to be under them. That way they don't feel as bad about their situation. And so that's how I felt when I read our vice president's book, Hillbilly Elegy. I read it years ago before I knew who he was when the book came out, and I read it. And that's the premise, basically, is that his grandma and whomever felt like, oh, well, we're not taking all this money from the government. We're not on welfare. We're not this, that, and the third. But your mama was stealing drugs from the hospital, and was addicted. But it's not the same.
But it's scapegoating. And a lot of these folk, here's the thing I tell people. Everybody depends on government. The very wealthy, the billionaires, the oligarchs, the Elon Musk and the Mark Zuckerberg and the Jeff Bezos, they all depend on government too. That's why they contribute millions of dollars to someone's campaign to make sure that the government they depend on gets elected so they can get subsidies and tax breaks and tax cuts and all this other stuff. So we all depend on government. That's part of the social contract. We give up a certain level of freedom in exchange for the government taking care of our basic needs. So these folk living in these rural areas that say, I don't depend on government. Yeah, you do. You get food assistance, but you don't see it as a bridge card. You have health care that you call the Affordable Care Act, but it's really Obamacare, which you don't think you have, but that's what you have. And it's rooted in Medicaid expansion. So, you can't convince some of these folk that, yeah, you are on the dole. And it's okay. Because that's what the government is there. That's the social safety net to get you on your feet so you can get a job and then start paying back into the tax system that took care of you when you couldn't take care of yourself. But instead of seeing it that way, they see it as something that Black and brown folk are relying on and taking away our tax dollars and spending it on. It's going to them. So it's an ideology that's just not rooted in facts. And it's hard to convince people otherwise.
Yeah, because I feel like there's enough books, there's enough conversations,
Seriously.
There's enough think pieces, there's enough YouTube videos.
There's enough data, concrete data.
There are enough TikToks. There are TikToks where people spend the time and break that stuff down for you, even talking about the 1980s welfare queen and how she didn't really exist.
Right.
I don't know the answer to how you actually get folks to believe that fat meat is greasy. Like, how do we get to that point?
I think I might be a little optimistic because I'm usually pessimistic, but I think we're kind of getting to that with this second administration. 12.1 million people, mostly white, took to the streets on June 14th in the No Kings protest. Those weren't all Democrats. A lot of those people were Republicans that voted for Donald Trump. They're showing up at town halls. They're confronting their elected officials who are indifferent to what they're saying, who are mocking and laughing at them because they are confident that no matter how angry you are, there are two things I know about voters, mainly white voters that vote conservatively. They have a very short memory. They have amnesia. So by the time the 2026 election rolls around, the midterms, they're going to forget how nastily we treated them, and they're going to vote for us again. I wouldn't count on that if I was them at this point. But nevertheless, this is how they think. This is how the GOP elected officials think. That no matter how angry you are, all I got to do is throw out some cultural red meat, some replacement theory, and you're going to go for the bait every time. And by November 26th, you're going to be voting for us to control these Black and brown people that you see as a threat to your personal safety. But I'm seeing a lot of activism and mobilization on the part of whites to resist Donald Trump. And I think that they're starting to realize that they've got a person in office that's hurting everybody, not just the people they thought would be hurt when they voted him in. So there may be a change of mind here. I don't know. November 2026 will tell. But there have been some special elections, with the exception of the two that happened in Florida, where we had a chance to take back the House. And unfortunately, they still upheld the GOP and they won those two seats in Florida. But we've seen some special elections where the Democrats have prevailed, where Republicans should have, where Donald Trump won by more than 30 points in a certain district, a Democrat won. So we're seeing some shifts now, and hopefully that will continue.
I think you are more optimistic than I am, but I appreciate it because we need that yin and that yang.
Yeah.
But because all of that is very true, and I think there are some folks who might regret their vote. A couple of things come to mind. One is that when you said that it didn't hurt the people they thought it would hurt, the fact that you would vote to hurt anyone,
right,
is such a problem. And not thinking about the bigger picture, not thinking about that we don't vote for just our own self-interest, that we have to vote for our entire community.
Yes.
And so, and then even the shift towards Democrat, though, I don't know what's happening with the Democratic Party. I don't know that I understand whether or not they have figured things out yet, if they figured out how to be better and how to talk about the things that folks, especially their most staunch supporters, their sturdy and reliable voting bloc of Black women that has been for decades, that they still don't necessarily listen to them. And they're still not centering those needs first in the way that I think that they could and should. And they're still sort of out here, to me, flailing and not focusing in a way that shows folks that they actually mean business. I think there are a lot of folks who are looking at Democrats like, y'all are just as crazy, but in a different way, because you're not doing the thing, which I think why there's also the reason why the independent space has grown so much, especially over the past year. Like, I think there might be more independent registered voters now than Democrat or Republican.
I don't know if the number of independent voters eclipse Democrats or Republicans, but I do agree with you that it's growing. And at some point, it might be very close to eclipsing those. But I think the problem with the Democrats and the Black community, and it's been a problem for a long time, we're between the devil and the deep blue sea. We are between a rock and a hard place as a people. One of the primary reasons why Black people vote for the Democrats, and I will speak personally for myself, is to keep the worst possible thing from happening. This is what Trevor Noah said once when he was on The Daily Show. We don't necessarily vote for Democrats with any real belief that they're going to do anything to really help our community. But we vote for them because we know the other guys want to harm our community. And we know that the Democrats, if they don't do anything else, they will stand in the way of that. They will keep the worst possible thing from happening to us. We would not see folk being snatched off the streets, when I'm talking about Latinos, and being deported to a gulag in El Salvador with no due process. Now, President Biden and President Obama were the great deporters. They were deporting a lot of people, but they did it through due process. They at least gave the person a chance to seek asylum and to defend themselves before they were deported. This president is not doing that. This is why these ICE agents are covering their faces, which is disturbing and dangerous. And they don't have a warrant because a warrant has to have someone's name on it. So what you have are Democrats kind of still, this is my frustration with the Democrats and with a lot of voters, is that they are still trying to win a swath of voters they will never win. And that is conservative voters. They believe in unicorns. They believe there's such a thing as a moderate Republican who might be persuaded or swayed to the Democratic end of things. There is not. Almost all of those that identify as Republican now are MAGA. And those that are not are now independents, or they shifted to the Democratic Party. So the people that support the Republicans today, most of those people are MAGA, and they support Donald Trump. But the Democrats continue with this deluded fantasy that they can have an agenda that will appease these individuals. Listen, there are a lot of poor whites living in rural areas who need an expansion of Medicaid, who needs the protection of Social Security and Medicare, who need better and stronger public education, who need more access to affordable food and clean air and clean water. They need the same things we need. But yet they continue to vote against their own interest. And they know what the Democratic agenda is. They know the promises that Democrats make. They know every time there's a Democratic president in office, the economy overall does better. They know that. But they don't care because the GOP is sympathizing with their white victimhood. The GOP is telling them, yes, you are a victim of racial discrimination, of reverse racism. You are not being heard. You are not being seen. They are allowing these folks to come into this country and change what America is. And as a result of that, you and your children will suffer. The white birth rate has declined. We are going to be a numerical minority by 2050. We've got to stop. This is what they're listening to. And they're amped up off a diet of Fox News, which is giving them nothing but lies and propagandist BS. So it doesn't matter what the Democrats promised them. What the Democrats should be doing is, one, they should be fighting the way Republicans fight, using every trick and dirty trick in the book in order for them to protect this country, the Constitution, our democracy, and their constituents. And they should be trying to find a way to get those Democrats that have been sitting on their butts and sitting out elections to get to the polls. Because one of the things the Republicans are going to damn well do is they're going to keep their base as much as possible locked in. But the Democrats don't, because they're too busy trying to reach across the aisle, the figurative aisle, to reach for voters that are never going to come, instead of going and building their Democratic base. That's where they go wrong. And they play these institutionalist games where they still refer to each other as my esteemed colleague or my colleague. These people are not your colleagues, they're your ops. Okay? Yeah. At this point, these people are your ops. They are hoping for political violence against your very existence. These people are trying literally to kill you.
And they're still wanting to play respectability politics.
And they're playing respectability politics at a time when that has went out the window.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't know. It's the Democratic Party needs to find itself. But here's the thing that, and I'm going to say this, and this is controversial, and I know that if I say this on social media, I get a lot of blowback from Black folk. But it's not like we have a choice. Those of us that sit back and don't vote because we think we have a choice. When we say things like, oh, they all the same. One devil ain't no different than the other. When we say ridiculous things like that, we really have not studied the statistically innovative way that white supremacy works in this country. Because one thing we know in that 900 plus page document known as Project 2025, they had a whole lot of goodies in that book about us. And if Kamala had won, because what they're doing right now is implementing step by step, page by page, Project 2025, written under the Heritage Foundation with a lot of people that's part of Trump's administration. Okay, so one thing we know is that the GOP is going to do everything they promised to do when it comes to hurting communities of color. And we can do one of two things. We can vote for the Democrats to keep it from happening, or we can sit it out and deal with whatever comes. That's what we can do. But right now, we really don't have a choice. So this fantasy of a third party, like voting for Jill Stein and Cornel West and the Green Party and all that, that was a waste of a vote that actually peeled votes away from Kamala. There are a lot of people regretting that right now. Arab communities in Dearborn, in the state that I'm living in right now, are regretting that when they're seeing what's happening in Palestine and Gaza. So, it's like Latinos are regretting their vote because they thought their proximity to whiteness would protect them. So they voted knowing that there was mass deportation coming, but they thought he only was going after the criminals. Well, the term illegal means you're a criminal. So you don't have to actively break the law, just be here without an invite to come here. And that is considered a crime by this administration. So now they're seeing people who are working in fields, harvesting our food, working in construction sites, roofing, landscaping, working at the Home Depot, are being snatched. Children are being dragged out of schools, fifth graders being locked up in detention centers, separated from their parents. Children's parents are being deported while their sixth graders left alone at home and don't know what's going on. That's what's happening right now. But this was the same president that took babies out of their mother's arms in his first administration, the child separation policy. And yet the same group turned around and in a larger portion voted for Donald Trump and the GOP.
And they're using this mass deportation to fill these prisons, and then they're having to work for free. And so then we're back to having this slave labor. Mm-hmm. And it's just this vicious cycle of never. This country was built on slavery.
Mm-hmm. It was.
And the slavery has never gone away completely, because this country does not know how to exist without slavery.
Well, you have to also look at the 13th Amendment. There's a little clause in there, you see, that in the event that you are a criminal, you can be enslaved by this country. Mm-hmm. So we know what happened after, quote, slavery, quote unquote, ended. Then came convict leasing and peonage and all these other things where they came up with laws like vagrancy and loitering so they could lock Black folk up and keep enslaving them. So it's interesting that you're right. A lot of these people being sent to these detention facilities in Louisiana and throughout the country and even in El Salvador are being used as slaves. So we can use that little clause in the 13th Amendment, but we're going to ignore the 6th Amendment, which gives these people due process. So we're going to cherry pick which parts of the Constitution apply to this population of immigrants. We'll apply the 13th Amendment clause, but we won't apply the 6th Amendment, which gives them due process, or the 14th Amendment.
Someone I was just having a conversation with was saying that it made total sense. It was kind of like an aha moment for me, is that everything that's been happening over the past decade or so, since before his first term, has been to roll back Reconstruction. So anything that was gained during Reconstruction is what they've been peeling back voting rights since, what was that, like 2013, 2014, somewhere around there.
That's when the Supreme Court got involved, but the Republicans play a long game. Ronald Reagan's, it started with Ronald Reagan, the voter suppression stuff. And then I think he was the one that appointed John Roberts to the Supreme Court. And John Roberts, working as a clerk before one of the conservative Supreme Court justices, and also being part of Ronald Reagan's administration, I think he was also one of the federal judges that was appointed to the federal courts first and then to the Supreme Court. He's always had this long game of getting rid of the Voting Rights Act. So with the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act, sections 5 and 6, they were able to do this gerrymandering, redistricting, purging of voter rolls, getting rid of pre-clearance, where before you would implement a change in the way voting took place, you'd have to get permission from the Attorney General first, from the federal government first, before you could do that. Now they can do it preemptively, and then if you don't like it, you can sue afterwards. But the election has already happened, and somehow your vote was suppressed. So they've been playing this game going back more than 30 years.
Yeah. Same way when Dobbs came to be, with abortion becoming illegal. This long game that's being played. Well, before I say that, also, I think the reason why so many Latinos voted for Trump, it's been said because they've also played the long game with them and had plenty of conversations with them about what they said they needed, and even trying to help them with their immigration process. They were holding workshops and they were doing all of these different things, gaining their trust and also gaining their information for them to have for the long game, so that they could then do the things that they were doing. And so in a lot of ways they were duped. So I always like to leave a little bit of space there, is that you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And I think that is some folks there who really thought, because people are fed an American dream that's not real, and I can only imagine what that looks like from another country that you are trying to escape, whatever horrific thing is happening there, whatever it is that caused you to leave in the middle of the night, to, grab your babies and whatever, and not have anything, barefoot, whatever it is, sleeping on the ground, whatever horrific things you are leaving behind or trying to leave behind, and you throw it all for this American dream. And a lot of it is BS, basically, this idea of what could be here or what is here waiting for them, that then they're used as political pawn. And I can't imagine what that feels like, to know that you were used in that way and you spent all of this time trusting in a system that this whole time has been working against you, which I guess is basically what they do with Black folks, but we don't have, actually, I think there's less trust in the system.
We never trusted the system.
Yeah. And so for other folks who have trusted it and it's actively working against them, and they are feeding it more, they're feeding the machine that's actively trying to cause their demise. I think that's the wake up call that is happening and has to happen, I think, a lot quicker.
Well, the thing about Latino populations of people, I've said this before, Black people are the canary in the coal mine. We can tell, with the exception of indigenous First Nation populations of folk in this country, the people they call Indian, but they're First Nation folk, indigenous people. We two groups know the danger of white supremacy more than any other group. We tried to warn brown folk, Asian and Latino, and Muslim, Chaldeans in particular, what kind of nation this nation truly is. But they don't want to listen to us. And one of the reasons why they don't want to listen to us is because they bought into anti-Blackness so that they could have a seat at the table of white supremacy. Mind you, they were sitting at the kiddie table of white supremacy. They weren't at the actual table. They were sitting at the table in the corner, but they weren't sitting at our table. So whatever happened to them wasn't to the degree that it happened to us. So sometimes I hesitate saying black and brown communities because I see a lot of things happening to black people and not so much brown folk. But one of the things we understood is that one of the things racism or racist people in this country do is that they create mass categories of race. So if you are Asian, you could be Hmong, you could be Vietnamese, you could be from Laos, you could be Korean, but you're Chinese to them. You're all Chinese. And when they started calling COVID China flu and the China virus, and they attacked anybody that looked Asian. So it didn't matter what country you came from. Vincent Chin, who was beat to death in Highland Park in the 1980s, Highland Park, Michigan, with a baseball bat, he was Chinese. But the two white men that beat him to death the night before he was getting married at a bar celebrating, his bachelor party or whatever, they beat him to death with baseball bats in a parking lot. They called him Japanese because they were two laid off auto workers. This man was Chinese. They didn't care. He looked Japanese as far as they were concerned, so they were going to kill him. The thing that Latinos don't understand is that they don't make a difference between you and who they see at the southern border. So all of you are Mexican. It don't matter if you come from Cuba, Venezuela, Puerto Rico. It doesn't matter. You're Mexican to them. So these Cubans, for instance, and Venezuelans who thought they were better than other populations of Latino people, who thought that there's a difference between the way they see me, who came here a certain way, and those that came in through the southern border, they don't make a difference. And they need to understand that this whole mass deportation plan has nothing to do with crime, but it has everything to do with the fact that Latinos are the largest population of minority people in this country. They have eclipsed black folk. We are still between 12.8 and 13.5% of the population. Latinos are between 15 and 17%. They are the only group of women whose birth rate has not declined in this country. Latino and Hispanic women are having more babies. What's happening to the white population is shrinking. Household sizes among whites is shrinking. They're having fewer babies. That's where the fear is. So every time demographers project the white race, the proportion of white people in this country, and it's getting less and less every year out, that's where the fear comes in. So here we hear white replacement theory and reverse racism and all this other stuff. This stuff is rooted in white supremacy and a way to secure enough white bodies in this country to make sure they stay the population, the majority in this country. That's what all of this is about. But again, folk not understanding that these policies that are deleterious to your existence are rooted in racism that black folk been trying to warn you about for decades. And you refuse to listen. So now you are at the finding out portion of the effing around. And it's unfortunate.
Do you think there is a recipe or a way to abolish anti-Blackness?
No, absolutely not.
Because it's everywhere, right? Like even in African countries, and I have talked to immigrants from various African countries who talk about how Black Americans are talked about and how they are, stay away from those folks because they just gonna bring you down.
Mm-hmm.
You need to concentrate on what you're doing so that you can live your dream, whatever that is. And, we too stuck on what we stuck on that we ain't never gonna be nothing and never gonna get nowhere sort of situation. And so folks believe that. They come over here believing that from everywhere, no matter where they started, they get here. Somebody has heard something negative about Black folks what they believe.
Christine Greer, I think she's a political scientist at Fordham University. She wrote a book called Black Ethnics. And she talks about how Black people from the diaspora come here with an anti-Black attitude. Like Nigerians or whatever, they come here. That's just one example. Or people from the Caribbean, and they want to hold on to their accents so they can be distinguished from Black Americans, because they know in this country Black Americans are treated a certain way, but if they're from the continent of Africa, then they won't be treated the same way. Well, we know in the Trump's administration that doesn't matter at all, because he said Haitians were eating dogs and cats. which is a point I wanted to make before. Black people in this country, when we see anything happen to Black folk, no matter what part of the diaspora they come from, we react, we're upset. We got mad when he said that about Haitian folk. But he can call Mexicans rapists and murderers and things like that, and Cubans will go, where's the lie? So they don't see themselves as part of the people who look like them and speak the same language. They may be part of a different part of the diaspora, but you are all in the same boat. And that's what they fail to understand. We as Black Americans, we have made a seat at the table for everybody Black from across the diaspora. They haven't necessarily done that for us. But going back to your question, is there a way to eliminate anti-Blackness? I say no, because anti-Blackness is profitable. People benefit from it. If it gives you nothing else, if it doesn't benefit you financially to hold back a population of folk or be against a population of folk, it helps you psychologically. It helps you socially because it gives you a feeling of superiority. It's like the great late Toni Morrison said, what are you in the absence of your racism? Are you any smart? Are you any good? James Baldwin said, you need the Nigger. You created that. You created the N-word. He's a figment of your imagination. That's how you imagine me to be. And you need that person to exist so that you can feel better about who you are. So you can build an entire oppressive system on the backs of those people that you are calling the N-word. Well, I'm not your N-word because there's no such real thing as that. You know that. So the question is, who's the N? Because it's not me. That's what James Baldwin said. So there are people that benefit from anti-Blackness. Other groups of minorities in this country have benefited from Blackness. When they came over on Ellis Island, my grandmother used to tell me that they were told, and this is factual, you can research it, they were told which groups of people to avoid. When they came from Poland, when they came from Greece, when they came from Italy, avoid the Black folks. So even in Black Bottom, you had people that were Polish, you had people who were Irish, you had people who were Italian living in Black Bottom, Paradise Alley, but they were living segregated from Black people living there. And they were the ones a lot of times that owned the stores and things like that. Black people owned businesses in Black Bottom and Paradise Alley, but so did Italian people. And they treated us a certain way because they were told that we were the criminal element. I mean, they didn't become white till they came to America. Let's face it. Whiteness is a social construction that's very, very profitable in the United States. And it goes back to the Bacon's Rebellion of 1656. I mean, you could go all the way back. But this idea of categories of race is a way to divide and conquer. So you have people of color that have engaged in anti-Blackness so they could have a seat at the table of white supremacy. But all the while we're sitting there warning them that this is what's happening, and they're ignoring us.
Do you think this is as much a race issue as it is a class issue? And I'm thinking about Isabel Wilkerson.
Caste.
Origin and caste, yes.
You can't separate the two. You can't, when it comes to Black folk, you can't separate class and race, because I'll tell you this, race eclipses class every time. Look at the discriminatory experiences that Oprah Winfrey and other very wealthy, very famous Black people have had. Their money did not protect their Black bodies from going through certain experiences of racism and discrimination. So we are part of a permanent caste, a racial caste in this country. And the way caste works is you can't marry your way out, you can't work your way out, you can't educate your way out, you can't, financially buy your way out. You're still Black. So you can't separate class and race when it comes to us. The experiences may be less probable when you're rich, but they're still possible. They're still possible because of your Blackness. I think about Professor Henry Louis Gates, the sociologist and genealogist from Harvard University, and how he was arrested on his own front porch because he gave lip to a white cop, because he locked himself out of his house and he climbed through a window, and a neighbor wanted to be a racist Karen, male Karen, female Karen, it don't matter, called the police, and they came to the house. He showed them evidence that he lived there, but he was, irritated because this cop kept trying to escalate the situation, and he asked him to step on his porch, and as soon as he did, he arrested him because he didn't have a warrant to enter his house and arrest him. He tricked him to come on the porch. So he was showing Henry Louis Gates, who is upper middle class, probably wealthy at this point because of his research and his books and his reputation as a genealogist and whatnot. He was showing him that even though I'm making about maybe $40,000, $50,000 as a cop, and you're worth 4 to 5 times more than me, I'm going to put you in your place. By showing you I, as a white cop, can put your black butt in jail, even if it's just for 24 hours, because you made me mad. That is
And
how caste
embarrassed him.
operates. You embarrassed him. So that's how caste operates. And then worse, this clearly racist cop gets invited to the White House for a beer summit by the first black president of the United States, President Barack Obama. So he benefited in a number of ways with that egregious move that he committed against Dr. Gates.
He did. I still have a bad taste in my mouth when I can still picture that beer summit in my head. What is your definition of democracy?
My definition of democracy is the right of the people to elect their congressional representatives to run this country, to have a voice in the way this country is run. That is what a democracy should be. And people who are citizens of this country, regardless of race, class, sexuality, gender, should have that right to choose the government that rules over them.
And do you think we have democracy in America?
Absolutely not. And we didn't have it when we wrote it up in 1776, when the woman asked outside of Independence Hall, when they were in there working on this, and this plan for this new government, and a woman confronted Benjamin Franklin and asked him, what are you going to give us? Are you going to give us a monarchy or something else? Are we going to get a king? What are we going to get? He said, a republic, if you can keep it. So a republic is a democracy. It is where the people choose their government. He said, but if you can keep it, because he wasn't quite sure that it could be kept. But at that time, we didn't get the right to vote. When the 15th Amendment was passed, which gave black men the right to vote because women hadn't gotten the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, black men were held back through Jim Crow segregation and the sabotage of Reconstruction. And even when white women got the right to vote in 1920, black women were held back. And then we had the Voting Rights Act of 1964. And ever since that act was passed, the conservatives in this country have fought tooth and nail to roll back voting rights for black people because black people were supporting more liberal, progressive parties. So when the Southern Democrats fled to the Republican Party, then the Republican Party was no longer the party of Lincoln. And black people began to support the Democratic Party. So the fact that black people, when they vote in large numbers for the Democrats, the only way to keep the Democrats from winning is to suppress the black vote. So we've never fully had a democracy. Absolutely not. We've had one on paper, but not in principle.
And I'm glad you broke that down because, I'll see randomly on social media, people say that, Black people were Republicans, and I'm like, yes, but that was a different time and Republicans stood for something different before everything did the switch. But instead of actually taking the time to dive a little bit deeper into the history, we hear these, really short talking points or headlines or whatever, or 45-second TikTok videos, and then that's all the information that they have. And all
it's disingenuous, excuse my French, bullshit. That's exactly what it is. They know better. It's propagandist crap. When Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, he said, there goes the Southern Democrats. We've lost them completely. So it was really in 1964-65 that black people really shifted fully to the Democratic Party. I mean, John F. Kennedy was a Democrat. And they voted in a large number for John F. Kennedy. FDR was a Democrat. And even though black people in the South couldn't vote because of Jim Crow, black people in the North voted for the Democrats. I forget if Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat or a Republican, but a large number of black people voted for Woodrow Wilson, who was probably one of the most overtly racist presidents in history, next to Donald Trump, who had a screening of Birth of a Nation at the White House and called it history written with lightning. He fully supported it. He was a Democrat. So we've been voting for the Democratic Party going all the way back to maybe 100 years. So we've been shifted away from Republicans.
Yeah. And I don't think there's enough people who understand the racism that Woodrow Wilson had. I went down a rabbit hole probably last year reading about him and watching YouTube videos, and it just got worse and worse.
Yeah. And he famously refused to sign anti-lynching legislation. Most presidents did. I think the first president that had made an attempt to do so was Harry S. Truman, but I think he was vetoed or overridden by the Senate. I think he tried to do
Yeah.
it by executive order and they struck it down.
Yeah. And the idea of him screening Birth of a Nation, which for folks who don't know, do a little Googling about that particular movie, which basically was all propaganda about how Black men were predators to white women.
Absolutely.
And the Ku Klux Klan was a necessity in order to keep their communities and their white women safe.
Absolutely.
And to me, it was the start of using Hollywood and that sort of propaganda to change people's hearts and minds and to place things in front of them that then they don't know the difference between fact or fiction. And they also use that as a way to just boost what they believe. And it's happened consistently since then. I think also about how long the show Law and Order has been on the air. It's been on the air for 30 years probably at this point. And I'm a person who was a fan of the original Law and Order. I love Jerry Orbach and all of that. But thinking about even like Law and Order SVU, like just in the past, I guess it's been about 5 years or something that I was just really watching. And the Detective Stabler, I think he's angry cop, he's got all kind of emotional issues and he does stuff sometimes that is inappropriate as a police officer, and you're kicking people and you hurting people or what have you. And you've seen this over and over again on a multitude of shows, and it's done in such a way that to invoke sympathy from the audience, because this character, and this character just wants to get the bad guy, and the bad guy might have did something real bad. But
there's a term for that. It's called propaganda.
And that's exactly what
it's when they make police officers look like heroes no matter what.
And I think this is why we are in the place where we are now. So then when someone says defund the police, it goes straight to this conversation about, oh, nobody wants police around. And when you call the police, they just shouldn't show up or what have you, instead of saying, no, what I'm saying is that cops are human beings the same way everyone else is a human being. Their life is not more important than anyone else's life. Just because they wear a badge. They've chosen that job. They weren't drafted into it. You chose to work this job, and this is the job, and it could be a dangerous job, but it doesn't mean that their life means more. But that is the narrative on any of those shows or movies, like, oh, well, he killed a cop or he hurt a cop, and that's worse than killing a 27-year-old Black man from Hazel Park or wherever, right? It's just,
but we see that
life is a human life.
Exactly. But we see that in media when a police officer is shot or killed. They act like that's the worst possible murder that could be committed because these people are there to serve and protect, when in fact, a lot of police don't serve or protect any of us. I see on TV all the time how police get there in the nick of time, but you don't see them doing that in real life. We saw in Uvalde how police officers waited 75 minutes outside of a classroom while a mass shooter shot to death all these kids in a classroom and their teacher. But they were afraid to go in because they were afraid to get shot. I just heard about the violence that happened in Minnesota with Melissa Hortman and her husband getting killed. He was on the porch. He hadn't even killed them yet. And he engaged officers in gunfire and still managed to get in that house, kill her and her husband, Senator Hortman and her husband, and escape out the back door. And police still wasn't able to catch him for a day or two. Now, I'm not a cop. I don't know the first thing about it. But I want to know how he was on the porch and you all didn't keep him from getting in that house and killing them while you were just outside the door. You should have been shooting and running and shooting if some of y'all got shot. I mean, I'm just saying, if we go back television and how they portray the cops, they would have been shooting and running toward him to keep him from getting in that house to hurt Melissa Hortman and her husband. But that's not what happened. There was a case that happened some years ago in Connecticut. This doctor, I used to know his name offhand, his wife and his two daughters were strangled and killed while they were tied up, and the guys tried to set the house on fire, but the police got there, so they didn't burn to death, but they had already been strangled. And the husband had been beaten almost to death, and he managed to crawl out the basement and get to the neighbor's house and call the police. Police came and sat in a wooded area for about 40 minutes before they entered the house. The whole time they were in there raping and killing that family. And when the men came out the front door, that's when the police ran up and arrested them. But they didn't enter that house for at least 40 minutes while those people were in there being killed. So, we expect a lot from police because of what we see on TV. But the reality is very few people's lives have been saved in the nick of time. Of course, they'll say, well, it would have been more people shot if the police hadn't gotten there. No shit. But that doesn't account for the 20 that died, though. You still got 20 people that died. So, they say stuff like it could have been a lot worse if the police weren't there. We don't see police arriving on the scene, saving somebody's life in the nick of time. We just don't see that in real life, but we see it on TV, and maybe we've come to expect that, and maybe that's just unrealistic expectation of law enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a part of it's that propaganda narrative of this hero that is expected, and it's not what it is. And again, this isn't about hating cops or whatever.
No, it's not.
It's not. This is about.
But the fact that you had to say that, the fact that you had to make that point, that this isn't about. We always say that when it comes to police officers. We could talk about bad doctors all day. And rarely do I hear people say, but not all doctors are bad. We could talk about bad teachers. And I don't see people saying, but all teachers aren't bad teachers. When you talk about cops, people are always careful to say, but not all cops. It's still a lot of good cops. Because cops are a sacred cow in the United States of America. We're going to protect their reputation no matter what they do. So here we come with this label of bad apples. That's our way of separating the bad cops from the institution of policing altogether, so we don't have to fix the institution itself. We don't have to fix the tree. We just get rid of the bad apples. Well, the bad apples keep being produced by the same tree. So at one point, are we going to go after the tree itself?
Right.
The tree is rotten. So the fruit is rotten.
Right. No, I completely agree. And I've had that conversation more than once around what it is to mean to defund the police and what it means to put resources into spaces where folks will have what they need if they have access to the resources that they need, that we can help alleviate some poverty and we can help with the school systems, because having more cops in schools is not the answer for children to get better educations or to feel safer, because it's never working that way. And if we see it's not working in anything else, and if you've ever run a business or you've been in charge or you're the manager or you're a teacher in a classroom, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and none of your students are learning and they're all failing, then you've got to be like, wait, hold on. Something about what's happening here needs to be changed. And I need to change how I'm doing something. And I need to figure out how to make this better. That's like 101 of figuring out problem solving, but it doesn't feel like we're not in the game of problem solving when it comes to this space, that we're just going to keep doing stuff and hoping that something else happens. Or honestly, a lot of people may not even be hoping anything better happens. I don't even know if that's really the end game. We might say for us, we want that to be the end game, but systematically, is it the end game that they actually would want to solve homelessness and poverty and school dropout or any of these things, or unemployment? Otherwise, we'd actually have a real minimum wage too.
Exactly.
2 more questions for you before we wrap up, but I really do appreciate this conversation. What is your version of the American dream?
The ability to have access to the resources you need to make your life a success. I think that's what the American dream is. The American dream is about, we kind of see it as a rags to riches story, but honestly, it's more whatever your definition of success is, provided you don't hurt other people to achieve it, is having resources to be able to do that. So if that's education, if that's a loan from a bank to start your own business, or to get that job that you think is a dream job so you can have the life you want to live, that's what the American dream is. Having that access to the resources to make your dream a reality.
And that is very close to a reproductive justice pillar. And that makes complete sense. So before we go, I want to get your thoughts on, is there any hope for the thousands of missing and murdered Black women to receive the dignity that they deserve in the future? Is it possible for systematic changes so that people who are now missing, Black women, will be missing in the future, and the ones that have never been found, do you think they'll get the dignity that they deserve?
I think that it's possible. The probability question is another issue. I don't know if it's very probable, but I think it's very possible. But I still am a little bit optimistic when it comes to probability when people like you invite me on podcasts and I get to do book talks, people discover my book because it starts the conversation that needs to be had. There's a lot of activism that's going on right now to get more attention from media on missing and murdered women and girls, Black missing and murdered and missing Black girls and women. There are podcasts, there are organizations, there's a lot of activism going on, there's documentaries. So I am hopeful because we're now starting to have a conversation. And when you have people like Gabby Petito's family, the young white woman who was murdered by her boyfriend, and she got a lot of attention, and her family said, for every Gabby Petito, there are hundreds of Black women and girls who are missing. They need attention too. They deserve the same level of care that my daughter received from media, from police. That helps. Having allies step into this conversation and say, we need more justice for these groups. So I'm hopeful that that's taking place right now.
Yeah, we have to open our mouths and say something.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Neely, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time. I appreciate your thoughts. I appreciate your tireless effort on this subject. I appreciate these books that I hope folks will go out and buy and learn about so much just biases that has been historically bias in the police departments across the country, and that folks will have some aha moments, ways in which way they can think of how they can be a part of the solution, whether that's policy or within their community or within their church or just pushing for police departments to do better. I think that we all just have to do our part, and we have to say something as often as possible. So I appreciate you. I appreciate your work. I appreciate your books.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Thank you.
And thank you so much for being a guest on Sticky Note Conversations.
Thanks for listening to Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington. Hosted and executively produced by Erika Washington, with editing by Black Gypsy LLC and Simone Endres. Special thanks to KUNV 91.5 in Las Vegas. This show is powered by Make It Work Nevada, a project of Tide's Advocacy. And a special thank you to Grov GT Tigue and Inohs Sivad, who made our new theme song, Way Below Acceptable.